I spent 100 days building a custom birch forest in Minecraft because we can all agree that birch forests are pretty bland and need an update. So over the next 100 days, I'll be transforming this boring default terrain into a colorful and immersive custom biome with beautiful trees, rivers, boulders, houses, and more, all in my 900-day survival world. If you do enjoy this video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing because it helps me get closer to my goal of 10,000 subscribers. I started off on day 0 by taking a look at what I had to work with. There was a massive hill in the way where I wanted to build, so I placed down a haste 2 beacon so I could shave off as many blocks as I could. And then I took a quick break to go to my storage room to get my leads to gather up some sheep, since I'd be using wool later in my build, so I thought I might as well just get that started early. I woke up the next day getting back to work, realizing there was a large amount of animals just chilling in the area, which were kind of getting in my way, so I unalived as many as I possibly could. After digging a bunch of dirt, my shovel was getting close to breaking, so I flew to my castle trading hall to trade them glass panes for XP. On the way back, I dropped off some blocks into my chest, then got straight back to mining. At this point, I was getting so many items that I just started burning them in fire because I literally just couldn't be bothered making more storage for them. On day 3, I was mining stone and found there was a part of the hill where the haste beacon didn't reach, so I destroyed it and replaced it in a more centralized spot. Then for the next 2 days, I spent grinding out a long chunk of the area. Another quick repair of my pickaxe and shovel later, I took a step back to look at the progress I had made, and it was pretty disappointing. I only mined like 1/10 of the hill, and I didn't want to waste a bunch more days just straight up digging. So I went into the nether to travel back to my old base since there was a desert nearby. I needed a bunch of sand for TNT, which hopefully would speed up the process by a lot. So almost 4 shulker boxes later, I went back home, quickly repaired my shovel, and climbed down the ladder to my creeper farm. While in there, I crafted up a solid 9 stacks of TNT, which I've had gunpowder in there for a long time from a little bit of AFKing here and there. When I got back to the digging site, the sun was setting and I picked up my beacon again so that I wouldn't blow it up. And on day 8, I began testing out the TNT by using a technique where I dig down and then fill the hole entirely with TNT, which ended up doing a ton of damage. But I wanted to try out other methods, so I placed a bunch of them randomly on top of the hill to see if it would be a little more efficient this way. And when I set it off, I quickly realized I spread them a little too far apart, and it also didn't end up doing that much damage. So I went back to the other technique of digging holes and then placing a pillar of TNT, this time doing multiple pillars at the same time, and that seemed to give the best results by far. I'm pretty sure the TNT would kind of chain together and connect the 2 holes, if that makes sense. I'm not going to bore you too much with the digging, but I pretty much just spent the next few days zoned out listening to music and doing the same thing over and over until I completely ran out of gunpowder for TNT. Oh yeah, I also almost died. I kind of forgot to mention that. And on day 12, I placed down the beacon once again to clean up all of the floating bits of stone that the explosions missed, as well as some of the edges, which took me all night and a little bit of the morning, but it made a huge difference in how it looked. It definitely looked way more open. Because of the lack of gunpowder, I finally caved in and decided it was finally time to try out a TNT duper, since I knew it would be a lot cheaper and easier. So I headed to a nearby swamp to kill a bunch of slimes for all of the slime blocks. So I got a few stacks before the nighttime ended, which amounted to 36 slime blocks. On the way back home, I mended up my pickaxe and shovel, then traveled to the nether to go to the closest warm ocean I knew about to grab a bunch of coral fans because for some reason you need them for a TNT duper. When I got back, I crafted up the rails and mine carts needed, put it all in a shulker box, and then flew back to the dig site to destroy the beacon for the 800th time this video so that I wouldn't blow it up. I've never actually made a TNT duper before this, so the whole concept was pretty new to me, and naturally I was really slow at building these things, but I eventually realized I needed to make 2 lines of dirt scaffolding so that I could place all the blocks like relatively easily. And the design is by someone on YouTube called The Master Miner. He made a video that was like less than a minute long and it was super simple, so shout out to that dude. But anyways, I decided to tweak the design so that I could manually trigger it instead of an observer clock constantly triggering it. So I made a redstone line with a lever in the middle, and now it was finally time for the moment of truth. Did I build this thing right, and will it work? And the answer is no. I was super confused because I went into a creative testing world before this to see if the design still worked, and it did just fine. And I'm like, what? So I rebuilt it again thinking maybe I did something wrong the first time, even though I was pretty confident I built the thing actually correct. Then I tried it again and nothing. And then I tried it again, nothing. So I'm just like, alright, what's going on? I seriously did something wrong here. So I broke the minecart and I realized I'm an idiot and I used the wrong type of rail. I used an activator rail instead of a detector rail. I crafted up the right ones this time, then flew back to replace them, put the minecarts on top, and then flicked the lever, and it actually worked. Then I kind of just kept triggering it in bursts so that like 3 or 4 TNT would blow up and spread out a lot. And I did that until I was relatively at the same level as the rest of the ground. After I was done with that spot, I would break the whole contraption and then rebuild it again like 6 blocks backwards. Then I would blow stuff up, break down the machine again, rebuild the machine, blow stuff up, break down the machine, rebuild the machine. You get the idea. I did this repeatedly for like 6 days straight, so I don't want to bore you too much with all this stuff. But yeah, it was kind of just the same thing over and over. On day 24, I looked back at the area, and as you can see, I absolutely decimated this place. But there was still a bunch of flying bits of stone all over, so I placed down the beacon once again so that I could clean everything up. I went through the tedious task of flying upwards, landing on some random flying stone, insta-mining all of it, and then trying to find a way to get every little block without falling. And let me tell you, I probably fell like 100 times, especially trying to fly on top of the single blocks with nothing around them. This process took a lot longer than I thought it would. I was doing it all night, in-game, not like in real life, and some of the morning of day 25. And here's the final product. It's definitely not perfect, but it's something I can work with, so that's really all that matters. After doing a bit of cleanup, I flew to the castle to fix up both of my tools. And I just found this clip, so I should probably mention that earlier that day I went to my bee farm to craft up as many honey blocks as I could. Then the next day I came back to it because I realized I was going to need a lot of honey blocks because for some reason I decided to design some of the trees using honey blocks like every other sane person would. That meant I needed to expand my tiny bee farm. The materials for the farm weren't that expensive. I just needed to find some bee nests in the wild, trade redstone with villagers, and figure out how to craft dispensers and comparators because I definitely know how to do that. I needed to make space for like 5 more slots of bees, so I dug out a chunk of stone and dirt and then just started copying the design I had from before. While I was trying to move some glass, I accidentally hit a bee, which caused me to panic because I didn't want them all to escape, but I managed to seal it up in time. A few of them did end up dying, but I finished up the farm by placing in the rest of the bee nests. The morning after that, I bred some bees because I didn't know if all of them actually had a nest or not, especially since some of them died earlier. Next, I quickly bred up the sheep and went on a journey to start the real material gathering quest, which was to get an absolute ton of moss, since it would be the main ground block of the biome. I found this azalea tree that I've been to before to see if there's a good lush cave down there, and lo and behold, it was absolutely garbage. I found another one nearby that also had like 0 moss whatsoever, so I traveled back to the castle to go into the nether, since I remember finding a bunch of new azalea trees by the desert from earlier in the video. I dug down and found actual moss this time, so I started insta-mining it with my efficiency 5 diamond hoe. While I was down there, I also got some clay, since I'd be using a little bit of it for some rocks later in the build. Throughout the night, I found a bunch of little caves and got a decent amount of moss, and I was slowly filling up my first shulker box. But then I was casually breaking some moss and I found literally the biggest cave I have ever seen in my life. I actually hit the jackpot for moss that day. Oh yeah, and of course there were diamonds everywhere as well. The next 2 days I spent just going ham with the diamond hoe, getting like 3 shulker boxes full of moss. I also was looking for as many of these small drip leaves as I possibly could find, since I'm pretty sure you can't farm them and they look really good for decoration. After all of the boxes were fully filled up, I flew home and started organizing all of the moss that I had, putting it into some double chests. The next day I flew into a nearby ravine to grab a bunch of andesite. I needed it to block out all of the rocks and such so that I could actually start building the terrain. I probably got way more than I needed, but I kept finding these big veins of andesite, and it's easily one of my favorite building and texturing blocks, so I just couldn't resist. After putting all my items away, I finally started placing down the first blocks of the build, only like 6 or 7 hours into the gameplay, so I kind of just began making an outline of where I thought I wanted the biome to go. I didn't have a super confident plan of how big I wanted it or what shape I wanted. I just needed to start it, and if I wanted to change anything, it wouldn't be hard. It might be a little hard to see, but here's what the rough shape is looking like. It's pretty big. I didn't know how I felt about it yet. On day 32, I patched up this random hole in the corner of the outline since it was going to get in my way eventually. Then I already started changing the shape of the outline of moss and then using FreeCam to see how it looked from a bird's eye view. After that, I moved the storage chest back a little bit since they were getting in my way. I also traded mending and unbreaking from some of my villagers so that I could make some unbreakable shears, because I was going to need a lot of colored wool for the trees I'm building later in the video. Speaking of that, I flew over to the very humane sheep pen and started dyeing all of the sheep red, orange, and yellow, so that's a little bit of a hint for what the trees will look like. At the end of the day, I clicked as fast as I could and sheared all of the sheep. In the morning, I stopped procrastinating and started actually filling in the moss outline with actual blocks. Again, I didn't have an exact plan for the structure of the terrain, but I kind of just wanted it to be like pretty smooth and mostly flat looking throughout the biome, and then I could add some boulders and interesting stuff on top whenever I wanted. Day 35 was a little bit different. I started roughly outlining a kind of hill thing where I'd be using andesite and moss as the base blocks. Then I started changing out the temporary blocks with what I wanted. So the plan was that the front of the hill would almost be like a mini cliff. So the andesite will be like rocks underneath the top of the cliff, if that makes sense, and then there's going to be moss on top. I finished off the rocks and then started placing in the slope of the ground with moss. The process of building custom terrain and survival is super time consuming, especially if you're trying to make it look natural. So I really took my time making the shapes I was happy with. A lot of the time I would just be taking a step back to see what I thought of it, rather than just building the whole thing in one go and then having to break a bunch of blocks if I wanted to fix it. I took a break from placing blocks and expanded the sheep hole because I noticed that they were eating grass a little too fast, so if I didn't, it would ultimately result in getting less wool. Then I got back to work placing a bunch of moss, which I think I forgot to record the rest, so whoops, but I finished it. On day 38, I started planning out 2 new shapes. One was like a small, long hill, and another one would be a boulder. For reference, here's what they look like from the sky. First, I switched out the dirt blocks on the hill, then I filled the rest of the moss on an incline. Then I saw this open area right next to it, so I decided to make a little valley thing in the middle, but I only dropped it down 1 block, so I don't really know if it counts as a valley. The next morning, I sheared the sheep once again, and then started work on the boulder. I don't know if I've mentioned this before now, but all of the moss and andesite I placed so far are going to be textured, so it's not just going to stay 2 blocks. It's just a lot easier to texture builds after you finish the shape first. So I'm going to add like a lot of different blocks. Like for example, in the moss, there's going to be grass blocks, there's going to be terracotta, there's going to be concrete powder. So it's literally not going to stay moss. Anyways, after I finished the shape of the boulder, I had the idea to add moss on top of it to make it seem like it's been there for like centuries or something. So I switched out some blocks here and there, and I think it turned out really nice. After that, I went back to the other side to fill in a lot of the area with moss, which lasted the rest of the day. I also placed down a bunch of torches underneath the ground because I've already had to take care of some mobs, plus I didn't want to have to hear zombie noises all the time. Next, I started to widen up the outline of the biome so that I could have a better idea of how I wanted to build an incline of moss, since I would have to do it eventually. So on day 41, I worked on building a gradual slope, and after a break to shear the sheep and organize some chests, I shaped out a 1 block tall, big circular shape and filled it all in with moss until the sun was setting. After sleeping away the night, I began building another small little hill thing with some rocks at the front. Then I was filling in some more of the ground when I realized I completely ran out of moss in all of my chests. And as you can see, I wasn't even halfway done placing down the moss. So I flew back to the desert where the lush caves were and dug down at an azalea tree. I realized I forgot to repair my diamond hoe, so luckily I remembered I had some XP bottles from villagers I traded with a while ago. Basically, for an entire day in Minecraft, I spent just going crazy, getting as much moss as I could, and I only stopped because my hoe was getting pretty much out of durability. After flying back home, I traded with my villagers and mended up both of my diamond hoes. Then I dropped everything off at my chests, sheared the sheep, and got back to filling in the blank areas with moss. I noticed this open area and thought it would be a pretty good idea to put something there. And I had the idea to put like 2 different sized boulders, almost like they're connected and one's coming out of the other. So I kind of just kept messing with the shapes for a while until I was relatively happy with them. I knew I could change them later, so I wasn't too worried. On day 45, I replaced some of the top of the rocks to be moss, so the same technique as the other one from before. After that, I grinded out more of the terrain and I lowered like all of the ground by 1 block to change it up a bit, since I realized everything was looking a little too flat. The next day, I decided that this little platform of moss didn't really look that good and I wanted to change it, so I tore out most of it and made another rounded cliff thingy. After I was happy with the andesite rocks, I filled in the rest of the moss, which slowly led up to the top, and I finished the whole thing before bedtime. Here's what it looks like from a distance. Pretty good if I do say so myself. Then after that, I got the idea to create a river that cuts through the entire biome. So I spent a really long time placing down moss leading up to the side of the future river. The reason it took so long was because the north side of the biome has this kind of steep incline that I didn't really know how to approach, so I really took my time polishing it and making sure it looked relatively natural. After yet another sheep break, and also repairing the shears at the castle, I finally was able to start placing blocks down on the other side of the river to really get an idea of how wide I wanted it to be. And I thought it would be cool to have like a little bridge that goes over it, so I decided on making it pretty narrow. Then I started to thicken it up so that I could plan the next hill that I was going to make on the other side. And so I placed in the first blocks of the slope, which I could tell would take quite a while to finish. Here's what the scale of it is looking like. It's a lot bigger than the other stuff by far, just because I wanted it to look a little different on the 2 sides of the river. Plus, I was getting kind of bored of how I was making the other hills. So anyways, I kind of just kept grinding non-stop until this thing was done, which took about a full day of work. On day 51, I started by placing down a bunch of torches underground because it was getting really dark down there and mobs were spawning. Then I got back to placing moss. I was working on thickening up the sides of the biome when I ran out of moss completely again. And as you can see, I still had a solid chunk of land I needed to fill in on the right side. So instead of flying all the way back to the lush caves, I decided why not just start texturing the ground with grass blocks, and I can just pick up the moss as I go. Then hopefully I'll get enough moss back so that I could place down the rest of it in the missing chunk. So I just kept breaking moss and placing down grass blocks, using a technique where I basically just try to make like kind of small patches of grass. So like sometimes 5 or 6 blocks, sometimes like 10, I don't know. It was kind of random how I did it. And again, I don't want to bore you too much, but I pretty much just kept doing the same thing over and over and over for like 4 days straight. I have no idea why it took so long. I guess the biome was a lot bigger than I thought. and I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss any spots. But yeah, it was pretty relaxing. I was just listening to music and grinding it out for like an hour or something like that. On day 57, I was finally able to keep going and place down more moss in the missing chunk. I also made another one of those small hill thingies with rocks at the front. Then after finishing that, I went back to placing in as much of the missing moss as I could until I once again ran out of blocks. So I went back to replacing moss with grass blocks to add texture and also give me back enough moss so I could place down the rest of the missing blocks. Then on day 59, I finally finished placing in the last moss blocks. And of course I had to add texture by adding in the rest of the grass blocks. After that, I noticed a spot where I felt like there was something missing, so I started making another boulder with a pretty similar shape as the other ones, and then adding in moss at the top for some finishing touches. The next morning I did the exact same thing. I saw an open area and decided to add another small boulder to fill in some blank space. After that, I got some materials together from my storage room so I could work on the river again. I placed down cobbled deep slate slabs a half block down on the side of the moss to make the water feel really shallow since the river is pretty narrow and it made sense to me. Then I placed in full blocks of cobbled deep slate in the missing blocks in the middle. I started the next day by texturing the river floor with different blocks like mud, black stone, dark gray wool, and regular deep slate. Then I tore out the moss on the sides of the river so that I could replace it with rooted dirt, and after that I went back to texture it all with cobblestone and coarse dirt to make it look a little rough. On day 62, I went down into a cave to gather a ton of blocks because I wanted to texture all of the andesite I used for the boulders and cliffs so far in the biome. So I got a bunch of tuff and cobbled deep slate from down there. Then on the surface, I got regular cobblestone and gray wool from my automatic sheep farm I made a while ago. For the next 2 days, I really took my time texturing the rocks, making sure they looked natural with shading going from dark to light using a gradient pattern. Texturing is really time consuming, but completely worth it if you ask me because it adds a lot of life to a build. So I highly recommend trying it out if you want to take your Minecraft builds to the next level. Here's the final look of all the rocks. Pretty nice if I do say so myself. For the next couple of days, I spent placing down some birch logs as temporary markers for where I wanted the trees to go. At first I placed way too many blocks down, so I had to remove a bunch. And then I made sure that the trees would be spread out a little more from each other. So on day 68, I was finally happy with the placement of the trees. After that, I came back to the river to fill it in with water. It was a little annoying because I had to go back and individually waterlog every half slab, but eventually I finished it by nighttime, and it was looking really nice, so it was worth it. In the morning, I destroyed the beacon because it's kind of just been floating there for a really long time, and I was going to need to build in that spot soon, so it had to go. Finally, it was time to start the real grind of material gathering for the trees. I flew back to my old base and into my unreasonably long storage system that I made a video on like a year ago. The first blocks I needed to grab were stacks upon stacks of red, orange, and yellow terracotta. Since the storage room was in a mesa biome, I had an absolute ton of terracotta from digging this place out, and luckily I brought a few shulker boxes with me, so it wasn't a big issue to carry it all. Right next to the terracotta was a bunch of red sand, which I started to craft into red sandstone, but the sandstone is really expensive to craft for some reason, so I had to fly over to some open area and shovel some sand for a while. Since I didn't want to waste a bunch of days gathering resources, I decided not to sleep and worked in the nighttime. Next up, I flew to a nearby savanna biome to chop down some acacia trees since I needed a ton of acacia planks, and it was going a little too slow for me, so I decided to just use my automatic tree farm instead to get the logs. The only downside, and the reason I haven't used it until now, is because it uses up a lot of bone meal, and my bone meal farm is super slow, so I usually don't like to waste a lot of it. While I was there, I also farmed some crimson nether trees, or whatever they're called, which I guess I forgot to record, but I was only interested in the shroom lights you get from them, so I got a few stacks of those. Then I flew back home to drop off all of the items. I placed down some new chests as well, and started to organize everything into certain block types and also colors. I didn't have enough yellow terracotta, so I bone mealed a bunch of sunflowers for yellow dye so that I could dye a bunch of the regular terracotta the right color. I sheared the sheep again because for some reason I thought I didn't have enough wool, even though I had 15 or more stacks of each color. Then I moved all the wool into the new chests. I took another quick trip to the old storage room to grab a bunch more terracotta because I realized I was going to probably need the same amount of glazed terracotta as regular terracotta, which meant I would need to smelt it all down. After getting back home, I dyed a bunch of terracotta yellow. Then I crafted up several furnaces as well as buckets, headed over to my lava farm in one of the houses because lava is really good for smelting a large amount of items, plus it's also renewable now. So I placed down all the furnaces, filled them with all the lava I had, and then put a bunch of yellow terracotta in. While I was waiting for them to smelt, I thought it would be a good idea to bone meal some mangrove propagules together, then using a hoe to break all the leaves, which exposes the logs, making it relatively easy to gather this stuff, even though it's definitely the most annoying wood to gather by far. Since I didn't have enough lava to smelt the rest of the terracotta, I broke a bunch of coal ore blocks I've gotten over time with my fortune pickaxe. This saved a bunch of time and was well worth it. The next day I flew over to the castle because I needed a ton of stacks of glass, which I got from the librarians. Then I went to the other room to trade with the clerics for redstone because for some reason I decided I was gonna build out of redstone blocks. After taking out the glazed terracotta and putting it away in chests, I was able to start smelting down the red terracotta. Speaking of red, I bone mealed a bunch of rose bushes for red dye, as well as some sunflowers for yellow dye so that I could craft myself some orange stained glass, red stained glass, and yellow stained glass, which I organized into my chests. I traded for some more redstone at the castle, and then started to remove the red glazed terracotta from the furnaces. Next, I decided to waste even more bone meal for birch trees because I didn't feel like flying over to a forest to chop them down there. The furnaces were all finally done smelting down all the terracotta, so I broke them all. Then guess what? I felt like flying over to the birch forest because, yeah, I needed some more birch logs. Nearby was a taiga biome, so I grabbed some of the plants there because I thought it would be a pretty cool idea to incorporate them into the custom biome. The main one being the ferns because they look really nice. Back at home, I got some different diorite variants together from my storage room, traded for some more redstone, then went down into the ravine from a while ago to mine more diorite since I was going to need a few more stacks of it. After that, I climbed down the ladder to my bee farm to craft up honey blocks from all the honey bottles that have been automatically filling up this entire time, as well as crafting some honeycomb blocks. Finally, on day 77, I had all the blocks needed to build the custom trees in these 6 double chests. Now, before I actually build them, I just wanted to mention something because it's pretty important, and this section is going to be a little bit different. So this is my creative testing world. It's where I design all my builds, and there's like rough concepts of what I wanted the terrain to look like here. As you can see, these are all the trees I'm going to be building in my survival world. There's 7 different designs, each with 3 different colors, orange, yellow, and red, which I spent a couple days IRL building. Now, in order to save an astronomical amount of time, I'm going to be using a mod called Lightmatica to basically create like holograms or blueprints of the trees that show me exactly where I need to place each block in survival. Obviously, it doesn't just like spawn blocks in for me. I still had to gather all the blocks manually and place them myself, so I personally don't consider it cheating, but I just wanted to be completely transparent with you because I think it's probably better than just pretending like I built it all naturally in survival. A lot of Minecraft YouTubers use Lightmatica these days, and it's just really convenient for making videos. So anyway, back to the other world. On day 78, I finished placing in all the tree schematics, and I was really happy with how they were laid out. Then the next step was just to start building. I first began building all the red trees because I didn't want to keep getting different materials every single time I built a new tree, so I decided it was going to be probably a little easier this way. When I was designing the builds, I got my inspiration from Pinterest, and I kind of just looked up birch tree concept art, which I found that concept art is the easiest thing to transfer over into a Minecraft build. And I basically like studied the pictures and I noticed a few things about them. Number 1, birch trees look better with branches. Number 2, don't make the top of the leaves flat. They're usually more curved. And number 3, they look really cool when they're other colors in the fall season. I tried my best to transfer over those observations into Minecraft, which, like I said, took multiple days in real life of just messing around in a creative world. Oh yeah, and I also tried to incorporate some shading in the leaves of the trees, so at the bottom they're a little darker than at the top. For example, for the red trees, I made a gradient going from mangrove planks to red terracotta to red wool to red glazed terracotta with redstone blocks and red glass spread out randomly. To show you a better view of building the trees, I also recorded using Replay mod, which is another really useful mod for making videos. As you can see, I build the trees from bottom to top because Lightmatica has a feature where you can only see like one layer at a time, so this is the most efficient way to rebuild schematics in survival. Next up were the orange trees. I made another shading gradient going from orange terracotta to acacia planks to orange wool, with orange glass spread out randomly. This time I didn't use orange glazed terracotta just because the block has a lot of blue in it and just doesn't really work well with the trees, but even without an extra block they look really good. Also, I forgot to mention that I've been using shroom lights inside of the leaves so that they light up at nighttime, and I think it's just a super cool yet subtle detail I decided to add. And here's the replay of placing in all the orange trees. Finally, I worked on the yellow trees. In my opinion, these are the best looking ones because they have some really interesting blocks. They go from yellow terracotta to honeycomb blocks and regular honey blocks to yellow glazed terracotta to yellow wool with glass all around. So definitely the most amount of variety of blocks for this one. And I never thought honeycomb blocks would actually work well in a tree, especially the yellow ones, because the block is pretty orange, but it still works extremely well. So I was really happy with how I designed it. And here's the replay of the final trees being placed. Walking through the forest now feels so nice, and it really goes to show how big of a difference trees make to landscapes. So I really couldn't be much happier with how they came out. After that, I started building a little house that I also designed in a creative world, which I'm not gonna lie, I kind of forgot to record most of it because I was kind of just in the zone, locked in, just building. Anyways, here's what it looks like with FreeCam. Nothing crazy, it's kind of just a box with a basic roof, but I felt like this was the kind of house that you would actually see in this forest if it were real, and that's all that matters to me. The next morning, I tore out the floor of the house and replaced it with some nice spruce planks. Then I began decorating the place, starting with a sink and a counter, then some bookshelves, a random pot, a plant in the corner, a second random pot, 2 paintings because why not, a bed, a bedside table, another plant, I'm starting to see a theme here, a lantern, and another plant. After that, I went to my storage room to grab a bunch of sea lanterns that I got from my guardian farm and place them down in the forest with moss carpets over them because I was sick and tired of mob spawning and ruining the atmosphere of my beautiful biome, and also making me scared that creepers were gonna blow my trees up. With some more free cam at nighttime, the place is looking really nice, and you can barely even tell there's moss carpets there. It'll be even less noticeable when I put in all the grass and flowers and stuff in. I headed over to the old base to go back to the desert so I could grab a bunch of cacti. Then when I got home, I put them all in a furnace to make green dye. First I crafted up some green concrete powder, and then I made lime dye and crafted lime terracotta. With those blocks, I started to actually add more texture to the ground because for the longest time it's only been moss and grass blocks, and adding more variety to the ground makes a big difference. After a nice break of letting a pillager disintegrate another pillager, I placed in a ton of lime terracotta, sometimes adding just a single block and sometimes adding in patches of it. And of course I didn't even stop when nighttime started. Then I flew over to some open areas and used my shears to harvest a few stacks of grass, then placed almost all of them down throughout the entire forest. I went back around and placed in probably the exact same amount of ferns, and went back again to bone meal some of the grass and ferns to be 2 tall instead of 1. I pretty much spent the entire daytime making sure I didn't miss any spots and tweaking the placements of grass. At nighttime, I flew a few thousand blocks away to a flower forest to snatch some different types of flowers, mainly getting the lily of the valleys, and then a few different colors of tulips. Of course, on day 93, I placed them all in the custom forest, starting with the orange and red tulips, which I would either put them in patches or by themselves. Then I did the lily of the valleys, which I kind of put them under trees and rocks and stuff. I don't really know why. I don't even know if that's a real flower, to be honest with you. So maybe they actually grow there, I don't even know. But then I placed in some white tulips because why not? Finally, I added some pink petals I've had in my storage room for a while. I decided to only place in single petals instead of 2, 3, or 4 because I didn't really want them to be like the main focus of the biome or the flowers or anything. Back in my creative world again, here are some rock designs that I'm going to be adding into the forest. I used light matica again to create schematics, which I already had all the materials for in my storage room. In the morning, I moved the first schematics into place and just got to building. For most of the day, I spent just doing the same thing, moving schematics, placing in blocks where it told me to do so. Probably not that interesting to watch, so I won't bore you too much and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. After that, I had the idea to use stone buttons as like baby rocks all around the forest to add little details that you would only notice if you actually looked down at the ground, and stuff like that are really what makes the atmosphere special in this forest. For the rest of the night and some of day 95, I placed in more of the rock schematics. After that, I flew to my old base and into my tree farm because I have another contraption next to it that uses bone meal to create fungi, crimson and warped roots, and nether sprouts. You probably don't even know what those things are because they're so irrelevant, but they look really cool in a forest. By the time I got back, it was already nighttime and I began placing them all down, this time switching between them in my inventory instead of placing them in one at a time like I did with the flowers. The nether sprouts were definitely my favorite because they look almost like shorter grass that add some nice blue colors to the forest. I did this until the daytime when a thunderstorm started and it scared the living poop out of me. It was so loud for no reason, I literally had the weather sounds on like 1%, but I decided to sleep instead of getting jump scared every 10 seconds. But anyways, next I placed down most of the small drip leaves, which a lot of them were from the lush caves from this video, and some I already had from a while ago. I also had another genius idea, which was to hide spore blossoms inside of the leaves of the trees so that the green particles would fall down when you're walking around in the area. And can we just appreciate the elytra flight skills that it took to get here? Anyone? Okay. To be fair, when I tried it again, it did not go as planned. Anyways, I think I installed like 4 or 5 spore blossoms during that day. Kind of forgot. But the sun was setting and I added a bunch of sweet berries to the ground to add more plant variety with some nice extra red and green colors. Then I bone mealed some glow lichen on the road of my town I built a few videos ago so that I could place it mainly in the darker spots of the forest, but also just on the ground for some random extra texture. After grabbing some rooted dirt from one of my many grass chests, I flew over to one of those taiga biomes with the weird brown grass to take a few stacks of coarse dirt for myself. Then I started tearing out some of the moss so that I could make a little path going through the forest. I used coarse dirt and rooted dirt for the full blocks, and I added spruce slabs on inclines to smoothen out the path and make it easier to walk through. I kept breaking and placing in blocks and tweaking the look of it to make it seem like not a perfect pathway. I purposely made it look rough with some moss blocks kind of invading in on the dirt, if that makes sense. And I did this until I got to the little house I built, and I was really satisfied with how it looked. Next, I constructed this little spruce bridge I designed in a creative world like 5 minutes before this clip, since I was too scared to waste a lot of time because there was still some stuff I wanted to do. So I had a picture on my phone and I just copied that. Yeah, it's a pretty neat little bridge, nothing too fancy, but it does the job. So a few weeks back, I was watching a B00-100 Hermitcraft video, and he was trying to find a way to keep a drip leaf in the down position, but he also found a way to make like atmospheric sounds with them that almost sound like leaves are crunching on the ground. So I took that idea and figured out a really simple way to do it with a path block, an armor stand, fences, a piston, and something to power the piston. Then on day 99, I got materials together and dug out a little area underneath the entrance of the biome, and slowly but surely rebuilt the contraption. The best thing about it is I can reuse the piston, redstone blocks, and fences, so it's literally the simplest thing ever to build, and it adds a ton to the area. So I built the same design probably like 7 or 8 times, I don't really remember, but I spread them out across the forest in the main places you would walk through. And I think in one spot I added 2 right next to each other but timed them differently so that they would make noises at separate times. Here's a video from earlier when I was chilling in the forest with the sounds in the background. They're pretty quiet and subtle, but it's pretty cool to actually have the ability to build ambient sounds into survival Minecraft, so I highly recommend trying this out in your world. The last thing I did in the night of day 99 was build in a little fallen birch tree that seems to have been there for so long that moss has started growing on it. Yet another small detail, but it adds like a little story into the forest, so I thought it was really cool. Finally, after 100 days of building a custom birch forest in Minecraft, I was ready to sleep away the night and walk through the forest for one last time. If you made it through the whole video, I want to thank you so much for watching. This video took me many hours to make, so if you want to support the channel, please consider dropping a like and also subscribing, because it helps me out more than you think. This project was probably the most fun I've had while making something in Minecraft, so let me know what other biomes you'd want to see me make next in the comments, and there's a chance I'll make a video from your idea. Alright, that's all for me. Love you, bye.